10 Nights in a Barroom by Timothy Shea Arthur. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Nights in a Barroom by Timothy Shea Arthur. 10 years ago, business required me to pass a day at Cedarville, and I was delighted with the clean, comfortable tavern newly opened by Simon Slade, who greeted me like an old friend. While awaiting dinner, I had an opportunity of making several observations, the first of which concerned the landlord's family. Frank, his son, a boy of 12, was allowed to wait upon customers at the bar, and once I caught him draining the dregs of a drink left in a glass. His mother witnessed the act, too, and admonished him. A worried look continually on her face betrayed that she was not satisfied with her present lot. She had been far happier when her husband was a thrifty miller instead of an affable innkeeper. When I warned him of his son's danger, a broad smile lighted his good-humored face as he replied, "Nothing to fear, I can assure you. Nothing to apprehend there, sir, nothing." Simon Slade even compelled his lovely daughter, Flora, a 16-year-old girl, to tend bar occasionally, a task she little relished. Indeed, the proprietor of that flourishing tavern was more than sanguine of his venture. He claimed that the keeping of a good inn advanced the interests of the town. "Why, already, since I built and opened the Sickle and Sheaf, property has advanced over 20% along the whole street," said he, and backed up his statement by referring to some of the most important men in Cedarville, who encouraged him and gave him their support. Among these was Judge Hammond, the richest man in the neighborhood, and Judge Lyman, who had a few weeks before received the Democratic nomination for member of Congress. That night I studied the frequenters of the barroom. There was young Willie Hammond, pleasant and popular, whose personal qualities were strongly attractive. But his crony, Harvey Green, was an evil-looking man, much older than the judge's son, and I saw at once that he played the role of tempter successfully. No one knew this sinister stranger's calling. Judge Lyman, a bloated man between 40 and 50 years of age, was present and talked a great deal. He praised the enterprise of Simon Slade, and prophesied that in 10 years he would be the richest man in the county. "If he gets richer, somebody will be poorer," said a shabby, broken-down inebriate. The speaker was Joe Morgan, once a partner in the milling business with Simon Slade, but now a wreck. Soon after this bitter remark he spent his last cent for a whiskey punch. Several times he interrupted general conversation, always to give vent to some sarcasm or stinging truth. The company felt relieved to see his little daughter, not more than 10 years of age, push open the door and spring toward him. "Come, father, won't you come home?" she pleaded. Morgan arose and suffered the child to lead him from the room, seeming quite passive in her hands. Harvey Green was the first to speak after the father and child vanished. "If I were in your place, landlord, I'd pitch that fellow out of the barroom the next time he stepped through the door." His voice was cold and unfeeling. Battered Joe Morgan, however, found a defender in a man named Lyon, who took up his cause warmly. The disputants came to blows, and Harvey Green drew a long knife from a concealed sheath. Lyon, luckily, was too quick and too strong for his assailant, and felled him to the floor, where he almost choked him to death. Judge Lyman and the landlord now interfered, and the antagonists were separated. In a little while Judge Lyman drew Green aside, and the two men left the barroom. In the door, as they were retiring, the former nodded slightly to Willie Hammond, who soon followed them, going into the sitting-room, and thence, as I could perceive, upstairs to an apartment above. "Not after much good," I heard Lyon mutter to himself. "If Judge Hammond don't look a little closer after that boy of his, he'll be sorry for it, that's all. If you could look in upon them now, you would find cards in their hands." Then Lyon informed me minutely of the cause of Joe Morgan's ruin, saying that Simon Slade was largely to blame for the unhappy man's condition. About 10 o'clock a man past the prime of middle life entered. There was a look of concern on his florid face. He asked Mrs. Slade to find her husband, who could not look steadily at his interlocutor's face as the latter asked for his son. "He was here," said Slade. "When?" "He came in some time after dark, and stayed maybe an hour." "And he hasn't been here since?" "It's nearly 2 hours since he left the barroom," replied the landlord. Judge Hammond seemed perplexed. There was a degree of evasion in Slade's manner that he could not help noticing. Further questioning of the wily landlord revealed nothing, and the old judge quitted the place. Simon Slade then turned to me with a forced smile, and inquired whether I wished to retire, a proposition I readily met, for I was overwearied. Cedarville did not see me again for a year. As I alighted from the stage, landlord Slade gave me hearty welcome. There seemed to be no change in that jolly round face. "How is the sickle and sheaf coming on?" I inquired. "First rate," was the answer. In recounting events since my last visit, Slade told me that Judge Hammond had bought his old mill, which would be turned into a distillery. Simon Slade thought this would wonderfully help the grain raisers of the section. Avoiding argument, I asked after Willie Hammond, who also was reported as first rate. Frank Slade next came under my eye. He had grown considerably, but a gross sensual expression was now about his mouth. He was laughing at some low, obscene remarks made by Harvey Green. Just then Flora, the boy's really beautiful sister, passed through the room, and Green addressed her familiarly. She resented his overtures, but her brother treated the affair lightly. "Ah," thought I, "have the boy's pure impulses so soon died out in this fatal atmosphere?" After supper I took a seat in the barroom to watch its denizens. The custom had increased. What pained me most was to see the large number of lads and growing men who came in to lounge and drink. Among these was a lad named Edward, whose elderly father came in to take him home, and I was glad to see that the youth had enough courage to leave his sneering companions. But my attention was attracted by the angry voice of Simon Slade ordering Joe Morgan out of the place. He showed no inclination to obey. Instead, he let loose his biting contempt upon the landlord, who, half drunk himself, was angered to an uncontrollable degree. Catching up an empty glass from the counter, he hurled it with all his strength at the head of Joe Morgan. The missile just grazed one of his temples and flew by on its dangerous course. The quick, sharp cry of a child startled the air, followed by exclamations of alarm and horror from many voices. "It's Joe Morgan's child! He's killed her!" Little Mary Morgan, on her nightly errand of conducting home her besotted father, had been struck on the forehead by the flying glass. Morgan sobered instantly. Mrs. Slade bathed the deep gash until the doctor arrived. The medical man soon restored life to the inanimate body. Mrs. Morgan, terrified and anxious, came in upon the scene with a countenance like ashes. She fainted, and her husband was full of endearments. In half an hour the twain, with their child, tenderly borne in the arms of her father, went sadly homeward, leaving more than one heart heavier for their visit. Mrs. Slade's humanity, together with a look of anguish mingled with bitter reproach which she had instantly thrown upon her husband, left an indelible impression on my mind. By the next night the injured child was in a high fever, which brought delirium in its wake. She kept imploring her father not to go out to the tavern. It seemed to be her sole concern. Though his nerves were shattered, Joe Morgan promised to remain at home. His wife, fearing an attack of his old madness, gave him strong coffee to drink, but it did not prevent hallucinations ensuing. Frightened, Mrs. Morgan ran for the doctor, who responded only to find the crazed father sleeping peacefully in the arms of little Mary. The spirit of his loving, innocent child seemed to have overcome, at least for the time, the evil influences that were getting possession even of his external senses. Oh, what a fervent "Thank God!" went up from the heart of his stricken wife. Later in the evening, marked by the above incidents, I was sitting where I could overhear and see all that happened in an adjoining room. Mrs. Slade entered. She had just come from the Morgan's house, where her aid had been a godsend. Simon Slade listened unwillingly to her account of little Mary's serious condition and the doctor's grave fears. There was a long silence. "If we were only back at the mill!" said Mrs. Slade. "There now, I don't want to hear that again," quickly spoke out the landlord. "I made a slave of myself long enough." "You had at least a clear conscience," his wife answered. More altercation followed. Simon Slade finally left the room with an oath, banging the door after him. What a revelation was in that passage of words between husband and wife! Against his wishes, the wife of Simon Slade again took her way to the home of Joe Morgan the following evening. Broken-heartedly, Mrs. Morgan related the events of the previous night, how her husband had awakened to a terrible fit of mania, and how Mary had reassured him. Since that time the sick child had rapidly failed. A glance told Mrs. Slade that death had marked her for its own, and before many hours passed, the little sufferer died upon her anguished father's breast, with the happiness of hearing his resolution to reform. "You will have only mother left," she had said, "only mother, and she cries so much when you are away." "I won't leave her, Mary, only when I go to work," said Morgan. "And I'll never go out at night any more." "Yes, you promised me that." "And I'll promise more." "What, father?" "Never to go into a tavern again." "Never?" "No, never, and I'll promise still more." "Father!" "Never to drink a drop of liquor as long as I live." "Oh, father! Dear, dear father!" Those were Mary's last joyous words. During my fourth evening in the barroom of the Sickle and Chief, I heard its habitués worry Simon Slade over being tried for murder in case of Mary's death. I saw Mrs. Slade enter sadly and break the news of the child's death to her uneasy husband, and I had the pleasure of contributing to a fund raised for the bereaved parents of the dead child. Then, curious to relate, the landlord's wife earnestly besought the customers to help Joe Morgan keep his pledge, and she warned them of the dangerous path of drink that each was treading. Nearly 5 years glided away before business again called me to Cedarville. The first thing that struck me, as the stage rolled on, was the altered aspect of the beautiful Hammond estate, now neglected and disfigured. A marked change, too, was visible in and about the Sickle and Chief. It had grown larger, but dirtier. Simon Slade had become rotund, coarse, and red-faced, while his bleared, swimming eyes evidenced too surely a rapid progress toward the sad condition of a confirmed inebriate. From natives I learned that Frank Slade had developed into a rowdy, and was a sorrow and care to his mother and his sister Flora; that Willie Hammond was fast going to perdition, led on by the detestable Green, who was suspected of being a professional gambler. The reckless youth had squandered, or lost, $20,000 since my last visit, and his father had been compelled to sell out his distillery plant. In the evening I noticed Judge Lyman and Harvey Green hobnobbing, and the pair disappeared together. Soon after this Willie Hammond entered, asking for Judge Lyman. Matthew, the barkeeper, answered in a low tone, and, after pouring down a glass of brandy, the young man hurried out through an adjoining room. It was not long ere 2 other well-dressed young fellows quietly followed in the same direction. Without doubt, in one of the upper rooms gambling went on nightly. A shudder crept over me as I strolled out on the porch. While walking there, I saw an elderly lady advance toward a house and endeavor to peer into the barroom. Ah, what a commentary upon the uses of an attractive tavern was here! My heart ached as I thought of all that unknown mother had suffered and was doomed to suffer. There was a peculiar restraint between landlord Slade and Harvey Green when they met next morning. That afternoon I learned of the distressing financial straits of Judge Hammond, through the dissolute habits of his once promising boy; and during the evening young Hammond appeared in the barroom, wild and excited, inquiring for Judge Lyman. Matthew motioned with his head toward the door leading to the sitting-room. Hammond understood the sign, and left the room. I sought the open air, only to encounter again the same lady who had patrolled in front of the inn the night before. When I addressed her, it was apparent that the woman's mind wandered, but I gathered that she was the mother of Willie Hammond, in search of her wayward son. At once deciding to find him for her, I located Green's room and rapped at the door. I knocked several times before I was answered. Green was able to shut the door in my face, when Hammond, hearing that his mother wanted him, jerked it open, and with blanching face confronted me. Through the doorway I could see, besides Green and Hammond, the landlord and Judge Lyman. Loose cards were scattered over a table. The young man swept by me with a bound. I followed at a slower pace. "Mother, oh, mother, what has brought you here?" he exclaimed, reproachfully but tenderly. "Oh, Willie, Willie," I heard her answer. "Somebody said you came here at night, and I couldn't rest. They'll murder you. I know they will." A few moments, and they were out of sight, but 2 hours afterward the prodigal returned to the room of Harvey Green. While I was in the office of a Mr. Jacobs the next day, Judge Hammond, looking wretched and weary, unexpectedly arrived. He begged our business friend to search for Willie and bring him home, as the boy had been out all night. I walked to the tavern with Mr. Jacobs, and together we mounted the stairs to the room of Harvey Green. Repeated knocking elicited no response, and we were about to give it up, when Mrs. Slade, pale and worn, learning our errand, bade us knock in a certain manner. This signal proved an "open sesame," and we found ourselves in the presence of Green, young Hammond, Judge Lyman, and Slade. Cards, slips of paper, a pile of banknotes, bottles, and glasses were in evidence. As we entered, Hammond seized some strips of paper and tore them into bits. "You're a cheating scoundrel!" cried Green fiercely, at which Hammond sprang upon the livid gambler, choking him until he went purple. Green, however, was equally quick, and he drew his knife, which he plunged into his victim again and again, then fled during the excitement that followed. Judge Hammond soon appeared on the terrible scene, and it was not long ere the poor demented mother burst into the room. The idolized son died in her arms, and the shock killed her. At this double tragedy the whole town was wild with excitement, demanding retribution. "Lynch the scoundrel!" was the cry, as the populace hunted for Green, whom to my horror I discovered under my bed. "Understand," he said in a grating whisper, "that I am not to be taken alive." When argued with, he consented to allow me to notify the sheriff, whose custody would doubtless save him from the mob's fury. But that officer with his posse failed to protect the murderer, who was shot through the heart by an unseen hand. Then pandemonium took possession of the inhabitants. Men drank themselves crazy in the barroom of the Sickle and Sheaf. By midnight both Judge Lyman and Simon Slade, as associates of Green, had been attacked and maimed. The former had his face shockingly beaten and cut, while the latter lost an eye in the scrimmage. Neither Frank Slade nor the barkeeper escaped uninjured. It was a terrible night. 2 years elapsed before I entered Cedarville again. Dilapidation and decay were fast taking possession of the Hammond homestead and the tavern. At the latter place things were in a filthy condition. Simon Slade looked a wreck, while his son Frank had grown stout and more vulgar than ever. The fact that Mrs. Slade was in an insane asylum seemed to affect neither of them. The terrible events of the day on which young Hammond was murdered completed the work of mental ruin begun at the time her husband had abandoned the quiet, honorable calling of a miller and become a tavern keeper. Flora, I learned, was with her mother, devoting her life to her. The dreadful death of Willie Hammond, for whom she had conceived a strong attachment, came near depriving her also of reason. Evening found me once more in the bar-room, where the coarse, vile language disgusted me. Frank Slade, the center of a noisy group, was the most profane. An old gentleman who called there for his son aroused the ridicule of the inmates, and stirred up the wrath of young Slade, who would have struck the aged father had not the man named Lyon interfered. Not long after this exhibition of drunken braggadocio, Frank and his father exchanged hot words, and almost came to blows. I could not remain to hear the awful imprecations that father and son, in their impotent rage, called down from heaven upon each other's heads, and so I left the bar-room, glad to escape from its stifling atmosphere and revolting scenes. The following morning I witnessed a visit from the sheriff's deputy, who served an execution on Simon Slade. Judge Lyman had won a suit against the unfortunate landlord, and he intended to sell him out. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity that led my footsteps to the decaying mansion of Judge Hammond. At any rate, I went, and came across the old jurist, alone and in a pitiable semi-conscious condition in the house that was now no longer his, it having been seized by creditors. My sympathies were aroused, but I soon discovered that he had no friends. Steps were then taken to have him removed to the almshouse. 10 years ago he had been the richest man in Cedarville. Now he was a pauper. Another discovery was mine that afternoon. Joe Morgan had truly reformed, had returned to his trade of miller, and was sober, industrious, and successful. News of Slade's falling into the sheriff's hands attracted a large company to the Sickle and Sheaf in the evening, and from scraps of conversation I inferred that Frank Slade's idle, spendthrift habits had hastened the present crisis. Both father and son were drinking heavily. Suddenly Simon Slade forbade Frank to take any more liquor. "Don't meddle with me, old man," angrily retorted Frank. "You're drunk as a fool now," returned Slade, who had seized the decanter. "Let go the bottle." They fought, and finally the young man, infuriated by drink and evil passions, threw the bottle at his father's head, felling him to the floor. "Frank Slade, you have murdered your father!" Sternly were these terrible words uttered. The parricide uttered a cry of horror and tried to shoot himself, but his aim was not well taken. Half an hour later, Frank Slade was a lonely prisoner in the county jail. Does the reader need a word of comment on this fearful consummation? No, and we will offer none. The next night a mass meeting was held at the Sickle and Sheaf, and its spokesman recapitulated the ruin wrought by the tavern in 10 years. Resolutions were offered and passed prohibiting the sale of intoxicating drink within the limits of the town corporation. All the liquor on the premises was destroyed. Then the people dispersed to their homes with lighter hearts and better hopes for the future of their village. The end of 10 Nights in a Barroom by Timothy Shea Arthur. Read by Mark Penfold.